The views, comments, stories, and opinions shared within this podcast are my own or those of my guests, and in no way represent the views of the company or companies that I or we work for. All stories, events, and tales shared within this episode may or may not have happened in the manner in which they are told. They may or may not have even happened at all. The details have been changed to protect the innocent and the guilty alike. This is Squawk Ident.
You're listening to Squawk Ident, an aviation podcast dedicated to the journey and the challenges surrounding the life and career of Aviator Tony, his co-hosts, and his guests. Together, we will explore the many pathways to an aviation profession, the realities of what a professional aviator can expect in today's marketplace, and we share many stories along the way. I'm your host, Aviator Tony, an airline pilot currently flying for a legacy airline with close to 20 years on the flight line. This is episode 43 of Squawk Ident, recorded on the 28th of May, 2020, from the Aviator Sound Studios somewhere in Southern California. On this episode of Squawk Ident, I am very excited to be joined by yet another amazing aviator who has agreed to share his journey in aviation with us. I am honored to have this opportunity to introduce to you a man who has dedicated over 20 years of service to our country in the U.S. Navy. He served as an aviation electrician's mate, a reel operator, and as a flight engineer on the EC-130G or KC-130F. He also held stations on the E-6A, the Electrical Work Center Supervisor, a Quality Assurance Representative, and a Flight Engineer Training Department Coordinator. He also was an E6 model manager for the Naval Training Support Unit. He earned his degree from Emery Riddle University in Professional Aeronautics and minored in Aviation Safety. His journey also allowed him to become a CFI, a II, an MEI, and a captain for a U.S. regional carrier that we here on Squawk Ident call Sandpiper Regional. He currently holds a pilot position on the Boeing 737 for Legacy Airlines. Please help me in welcoming to the show, Mr. Bart Meltzer. Bart, how the heck are you?
It's a pleasure to see you again, Tony, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you so much for agreeing to this. You know, you and I have been friends a long time, and we've kind of talked about this new hobby of mine in this journey in podcasting, and you've been very supportive, and I do appreciate that very much. And you know, from the beginning, you kind of think about, all right, what's my podcast going to be about? And how do I want to come across? What's my market? What's, who's the target audience, and how can I put my best foot forward? And speaking with you about your journey was on the top of that list of man, this guy's interesting. And we can actually probably record about 4 or 5 shows straight just on your journey, because I can remember staying up late at night, drinking a few beers at the crash pad, hanging out, and just listening to you talk about, being stuck up in Alaska for a long time, waiting for airplanes, and just a great way to spend the time. So thank you. Let's start off today with a little bit on how you got started in aviation. Was this something that you really just always something that you loved as a child, or was this something that grew and developed later on?
Well, the very simplistic way that I put it is, for the first 20 years of my life, I thought about it, and for the last 40 years of my life, I did it. So, I always wanted to be a pilot. Didn't have the opportunities when I was young. So when I joined the Navy in 1979, I was guaranteed A school, Navy A school, that's what they call them, for aviation electrician's mate. And so I went to boot camp in San Diego, and then once I graduated that, I went to Millington, Tennessee, which was NAS Memphis, Naval Air Station, Memphis, Tennessee. It was actually up in Millington. And I went to A school there. And because I did so well in A school, I was top of my class and graduated honor student. I had my pick of orders. So we had like 32 people in the class. We got 32 orders. And there was only 2 orders to fly. So for air crewmen, one was VQ4 in Patuxent River, Maryland, and the other was VQ3, which at the time was in Guam. And so I picked VQ4 air crewman in Patuxent River, Maryland, and the position was called real operator, and I had no idea what that was. And when I was talking to the detailer, the Navy detailer in Memphis, after I had graduated and got my orders, my pick of orders, he was telling me, "Oh, you're going to be a real operator." And he showed me a model. He had a bunch of airplane models hanging next to him, and one was a C-130. And he says, "That's what you're going to fly, and you're going to be a real operator." So I'm picturing myself sitting in the back of a cargo airplane with a fishing pole, watching something out the back of the plane. I have no idea what the hell that is. So I eventually found out that this was a trailing wire antenna system that I was going to be operating. So I wasn't a flight engineer. For the first 3 years, I was a real operator. And I sat in the back of the aircraft operating a trailing wire antenna system, which was extremely elaborate. And the trailing wire antenna was used to transmit VLF, or very low frequency. And the whole purpose of the mission of that airplane was to maintain a strategic communications link between the National Command Authority, the NCA, and the ballistic missile submarine fleet. And this was considered a survivable communications link because when you transmit VLF, there's really only two ways to do it. One is with land-based antennas, which are enormous and you can't move them. And the second is with aircraft, which is what I was going to fly. So, you know, I'm taking all this in and I'm wondering, well, what's this going to be like? So I don't really know. But I went through, once I got those orders, my next duty station was NAS Pensacola. So I went through aircrew candidate school in Pensacola in April of 1980 and went through that. We were across the street from the AOCS officers. You know, you've seen those pictures with the Marine drill TIs, drill instructors.
Yep.
Going, you know, really pounding on the plebes there. I mean, these guys are just wild. And so we were across the street from that. And I went through 2 months of Naval Aircrew Candidate School, graduated that, and that was pretty intense. It was involved. And whatever we did in boot camp as far as physical activity, Naval Aircrew School was like 10 times harder. Oh. So, I mean, we had to do 5-mile runs through obstacle courses and things like that, through all different terrains. We had all these swim quals. We had to go through all these different swim situations and water situations, like, you know, parachute entanglement. They drop you in the water and then your parachute drops on top of you and you let it sink a little bit. You have to kind of pull your way out of that. So they teach you how to do that. And then all sorts of other stuff. So the helo dunker, the Dilbert dunker. And I'm thinking of the movie An Officer and a Gentleman because they kind of showed all that stuff there. They kind of sensationalized it for the movie, but that was basically kind of what it was. That was an old movie. I'm kind of dating myself.
No, not at all.
So I went through aircrew candidate school, graduated that, and then I went to, I got based in Pax River, Maryland. So I got there in the summer of 1980. And I was based at that Naval Air Station for 13 and a half years after that. And I flew for 3 years as a real operator. And when I achieved the rank of E5, that was the minimum rank to become a flight engineer. So at that time, the Navy was sending us to Air Force flight engineer training. And my first school was basic flight engineer in Altus, Oklahoma, or Altus, Oklahoma, or Altus. Never remember how to pronounce that. If you do it wrong, someone's going to remind you.
They'll correct you.
They'll correct you. And so that was the toughest school I ever went through.
Wow.
That was the hardest school I ever went through, Altus, Oklahoma, basic flight engineer. Now, it didn't have to be that hard, but the Air Force made it hard because they wanted to weed out anybody who didn't have the academic ability to pass it. So the washout rate was 50%.
Oh, wow.
That was 50% of the people who went through that school didn't make it through. And the washback rate was 90%. So the washback rate was anybody who failed one test. And you got a test every week. It was an 8-week school, Monday through Friday, 8 hours a day. and I had a good 3 to 4 hours of homework every single day. And I had to do it, because if you didn't do it, you were going to be lost the next day.
Yeah.
You had to do it. You had no choice. So that's how they had this, 50% washout rate, 90% washback rate. I cruised right through. I was the only sailor in the class, of the Air Force class, and there was one other Coast Guard guy in there. And the 4 airframes that the Air Force taught in that class were the C-130, which is what I was going to be on, which is what I was on for the last 3 years as a real operator. C-130, the C-141, the C-5, and the E-3, which is an AWACS.
Mm-hmm.
And occasionally they brought in performance elements from the KC-135, which is different than the E-3. It looks the same, but it's not. And so that was the class. And the Coast Guard guy, he came in first in the class. He was the first one. I came in second, so I was an honor student in that class, but I was second. And then all the Air Force guys came in behind us.
That's awesome. In an Air Force class.
We noticed that.
Yeah.
And then my next school was flight engineer training at Little Rock Air Force Base. So that was specific for C-130s. And I went through training there, and that was about 4 or 5 months of specific training, and I had an instructor there, and it was a lot of systems training, and that was fantastic training. Both of these training courses were just fantastic. I mean, the military has some of the best training in the world. I mean, compared to the airlines, it's much better, because it's a lot more involved, because they have I wouldn't say it's an unlimited budget, but their budget for training is much, much higher than the Air Force. And the military, they don't have to make a profit. They're not there to make a profit.
Yeah.
So, not like the airlines, where they have to training actually hurts their bottom line. The more they train, the more it's going to cost them. And so there has to be a balance there at the airline. And I'm not saying that the airline training is bad by any means. It's not. It's just that they have to balance training and cost, because if they put too much into training, do too much training, it's not going to give them a whole lot more benefit, and it's going to hurt their bottom line. They can put themselves out of business.
Yeah, we've seen this over the last 20 years, where you and I started out we started out in the same regional, and we've seen this as time goes on. They used to spend 2 or 3 days on a particular subject, the systems or what have you. And then now with AQP, everything is so streamlined. It's like, okay, we got 2 hours to talk about this, 2 hours to talk about that, and you're out the door.
Yeah, there's a significant cost to training. But back in the military, they shovel those funds like they're baling hay. I mean, the training devices and the amount of money that was sunk into the training in the military was just incredible. I mean, and not just that, the instructors and almost everybody that was a part of those training programs were completely dedicated to the training. I mean, they were some of the best instructors and some of the best training I've ever gotten, not just because of the budget, but because of the people involved were so dedicated to it.
Yeah.
And it was truly a privilege to be able to get that training. It was the best training I'm never going to have to pay for. And flight engineer training at the time was called $1 million training, because that's what it cost.
Wow.
For each flight engineer. And it was really, really good training. I have criticisms of the Air Force, some of the ways they do that, being, in the Navy, but I still, have to say it was the best training, some of the best training I've ever received.
Yeah.
And, so I went back to the same squadron I left. As a real operator, I went back as a flight engineer. And so now I moved from the back of the plane to the front of the plane. And then I stayed up in the front of the plane for the next 17 years as a flight engineer. So I flew the C-130 for another 4 years. And then I transferred from PQ-4 in Patuxent River, Maryland, across the base. I didn't leave the base. I went to Force Warfare Aircraft Test Directorate. And this was one of the squadrons. They actually didn't call it a squadron. They called it a directorate. So this was a test directorate. So this was one of the squadrons that does testing on new aircraft that come into the Navy.
Huh.
Patuxent River, Maryland was the Naval Air Test Center, NATC is what we called it. Now I think they call it the Naval Air Warfare Center Aircraft Division, which is NAWCAD. but the Navy, they have to keep changing names and stuff.
Of course.
So there was a lot of test squadrons there, and I was attached to Force Warfare Aircraft Test, and attached to the R&M department, which stood for Reliability and Maintainability. Since then, they changed the name to Integrated Logistics Support, which is more accurate. And I was involved in bringing the 707 into the fleet. So I was part of the developmental test team to bring the 707, which we called the E6, and at that time it was the E6A Alpha, the A model, into the Navy. So I did a lot of work on bringing that in. I did deficiency reporting, which was whenever anybody writes up any deficiencies on the new design of the airplane, those reports came to me, and I processed them, and I would apply mil-spec violations to them. And on the Naval Air Test Center, we had this huge mil-spec library at the base library. So somebody would come in and write up a deficiency like, there's too many fasteners on this panel, and it impacts the mission because we have to undo all these fasteners. Let's replace these fasteners with quick disconnects like the airlines have.
Oh.
Quick opening panels.
Yeah, little Zeus fastener things.
So that would be like a Part 2 deficiency because it impacts the mission. A Part 1 deficiency would be like wing flutter. The wing is fluttering in flight. It may actually explode. That would be a Part 1 deficiency. And we had that. And then we had Part 3 deficiencies like the crew rest seats back up against each other when you recline. And the recommendation for those was like just avoid future design. So I wouldn't even bother with mil specs for those. But for Part 2 and Part 1 deficiencies, I would go to the base library, and we had this old microfiche system. So you would have to get these walls and walls of microfiche and then put them in the microfiche reader, which was just basically a big projection device that put it on a screen in front of you.
Yeah.
And then you'd have to start researching and looking at which mil-spec violation, military specification violation there was. So for instance, we had I wrote up a deficiency report myself on the oxygen mask that Boeing installed in the aircraft, as opposed to the ones in the C-130. The C-130 oxygen mask, they had hoses that were wire reinforced and cloth kind of on the outside impregnated with rubber. So they were very tough oxygen hoses. And if you're wearing an oxygen mask and you're crawling around in the lower spaces of the airplane with a fire extinguisher in one hand and a flashlight in the other, looking for the fire or smoke or whatever device is smoking, and you happen to put your knee on the oxygen hose on the C-130, you're going to feel it with your knee. It's going to hurt, but it's not going to collapse the oxygen hose, and you're going to be able to continue to breathe.
Huh.
The oxygen hose is not going to collapse. It's not going to kink or anything.
Yeah.
But on the 707, the oxygen masks that they put in the C1 or in the E6 and the 707 were rubber. There was no wire reinforced. It was just rubber.
Yeah.
It looked kind of the same, but I could collapse the hose with my just two fingers. I could just pinch it closed like that.
Sure.
You couldn't do. There's no way you were doing that with the oxygen mask on the C-130, and I found a military specification violation for that. So I would apply it. I applied it to that. Recommended going to the oxygen mask we were using. So I would process all these deficiency reports.
So you were really a key player in the development and improvement.
I was just one of the key players because there are so many different components of testing an airplane.
Sure.
I was like just one, and basically I would receive these reports from the fleet or from the testing personnel. They would write this stuff up, or I would write up because I was doing test flights as well. I was participating in this.
Mm-hmm.
So they'd all travel out to Seattle from Patuxent River and go to Boeing Field, and that's where I worked. And we worked down in the south part of Boeing Field, which was south of the Museum of Flight there. We called it the MAIF building, which was MAIF. MAIF. It stood for Mission Avionics Integration Facility. And so that's where our offices were. And that's where if you ever go to Boeing Field, you can see that's where all the military planes are parked down in the southwest corner of Boeing Field, just south of the Museum of Flight. So right now you have all the KC or the KC-46s, all those 767s, and whatever else they get, and the P-8s, the Poseidons. So that's what they're working on currently. But back when I was there, it was just nothing but E6s. Occasionally you'd see any AWACS in there in and out. And occasionally you still see some of our E6s in there. Boeing wants to look at something, or they want to just tweak something or whatever. But that's where we worked, and that's where I worked. That was my first experience in Boeing Field, and that's where I worked. And that was from 1988 to 1990 something. It was 1990.
Like 93 or 91.
No, well, Boeing produced these 707s, and these were brand new 707s after the 707 production line was shut down for like 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
They opened it back up at the Renton plant, built 17 707s, dubbed them the E6, flew them to Boeing Field, and that's where they installed the mission avionics. And the mission avionics, interestingly enough, were the exact same mission equipment that they took out of the C-130s as they decommissioned them. So as they took our C-130s and retired them, what they would do is fly them down to Love Field in Dallas, and there Raytheon would pull all the mission equipment out. And then they would package it, put it on a train, ship it to Seattle, to the Mace Center. It would come in there, and then Boeing would stick it on the E6.
Oh, wow. So they're really recycling here.
Yeah, so we just took the mission equipment out of the C-130 and stuck it in the 707.
Yeah.
And
when you say mission equipment, just to clarify for those viewers that may not
the trailing wire antennas that I operated as a real operator, the power amplifier that amplified it. By the way, we transmitted at 200,000 watts, so that was one hell of a powerful amplifier.
Yeah.
I can imagine. all the comm suite that went with it, which consisted of all the radios and all the different communications gear. And that was the mission equipment. Wow. So you had the comm suite, you had the power amplifiers, and you had the trailing wire antennas. And all that was taken out of the C-130, and they stuck it in the 707. I could send you photos of that if you wanted to include.
Oh, that'd be cool. Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
I could send you a whole bunch of stuff, and you could tweak it.
Yep.
So that was one of the most interesting tours I had in the Navy, and that was considered shore duty for me. When I was flying as a real operator and a flight engineer, that was considered sea duty. So Navy has shore duty and sea duty. But for me, as an air crewman, I 20 years in the Navy, I was never on a ship. Occasionally, we would fly over those ships, and I would look down and ask the guys who were on the ship. I said, "Hey, aren't those? Isn't that those gray yachts that the company owns?" Look down, say, "Oh, yes, indeed they were." So that was the closest I got to a ship, man. I watched the USS Lexington dock once when I was, at NAS Pensacola going through air crew school.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how big that thing was.
So the Navy, and not really ever a need to go aboard ship.
I always wanted to fly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it was not like I was trying to avoid being on a ship. I was just a flyer, man. I just wanted to fly continuously. And the only reason I joined the Navy instead of the Air Force is because I walked in the wrong door at the recruiting office in Fort Lauderdale.
Wait, I remember you telling me a little bit about this. Remind me now. So you are a young man.
It's not an exaggeration. When I was first considering joining the military, I was living in Margate, Florida, and so just north of Fort Lauderdale. And I went to the recruiting office, and I walked into the Air Force recruiting office, and I talked to those guys for about 45 minutes and listened to what they had to say, and so I could consider it. And then a few months later, when I came back and I was ready to go through more of a process and look at it further and get more in depth and actually join, I walked into the same office, right? What I didn't know is that the Navy and the Air Force had switched offices. So I actually walked into the Navy's office, and I couldn't tell. I was too naive to understand the differences in uniforms or whatever, all that. I didn't have a clue. I was completely clueless.
You had been there before, and it was the right place.
Yeah,
before.
So I walked into the same door. I mean, and it wasn't like you could see this. It wasn't like a typical strip mall where you could see it from far away. This was down the stairs, and so everything was kind of hidden, and you didn't see any of these doors until you just got down the stairs, and the door was right in front of you. And the first thing you did was grab the door.
Yeah.
So I walked.
At what point did you realize that you were in the naval office instead of the Air Force.
About a half an hour in. And these guys are hooking me up and telling me, blowing all this smoke up my ass and saying, oh, we got more airplanes than the Air Force does. And you know, when I finally figured it out, I said, you guys are the Navy. And they said, yeah, we're the Navy. Man, you don't want to go over those guys. They were trying to recruit. So the military recruits people based on how they recruit is decided by the needs of that service. So at that time, we're in 1979. It's coming up to the end of the Carter administration. The military is hurt for personnel because the morale in the military is bad. Carter was not good for the military. And the morale at the end of the Carter administration in all four branches was not great. And so they were hurt for people. So when they hurt for people, they lower their standards. When they're not hurt for people and they don't need that many, the military raises their standards.
Yeah, just like the airlines.
So they were trying to get everybody they could. So, so they got my ass.
Yeah, and you did 20 years in. At what? And you did last, position you was when you were over there in Washington State. Is that right? At Boeing Field.
No, I was never based in Washington State.
Oh, you were just working out of Boeing Field.
I was based in two places. So I was in Naval Air Test Center, Patuxent River, Maryland, for 13 and a half years. And then in 1993, the squadron that I was in again, which was VQ4, we moved from Patuxent River, Maryland to Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma City.
Oak City. Oh, okay. I remember that.
And also VQ3, which was at Barbers Point, Hawaii. They had moved from Guam to Barbers Point. And they also moved to Tinker Air Force Base in like the end of 1992. So the Navy had built these new facilities there at Tinker, specifically for the 707. So after we got the 707 into the fleet, both squadrons rebased to Tinker Air Force Base. So they built these brand new facilities for the Navy on the south side of Tinker Air Force Base. And they were really nice for us, man. They were like new hangars, new facilities. They even stood up a training center, which was called Naval Training Support Unit. They had another maintenance training called NAMTRE GRU-DET, which stood for Naval Aviation Maintenance Training Group. And so they had NAMTRE GRU-DET doing the maintenance training, and they had NTSU doing the pilot, flight engineer, and also what would be considered the job of the FAA. So they were the ones who set the standards for the fleet. Those were the model managers that were there, and I also became model manager.
And is that what they now call the VQ7? Is that right?
Yeah, they call it VQ7 now. So it was NTSU. Now it's just has a designation of a squadron.
I see.
So I guess they're now considered a squadron. That happened sometime after I retired. But when I was there, it was called NTSU. And originally, NTSU was stood up in Waco, Texas. And interestingly enough, it was the same that was 1990. So when I went through 707 training, so I did all that test work until about 1990, bringing the 707 into the fleet. When I was done with that tour, I went back to VQ4, but now I had to go through official flight engineer training for that, because even though I was a flight engineer and I had flown on the 707, it wasn't really officially as a flight engineer. It was more of an observer for the test flights. So I didn't actually have an official title there. But, you know, I sat in the flight engineer seat. I screwed around with the airplane. I loved that airplane, man. That was so cool. That was just the coolest airplane, was that 707. I loved it, man.
And I believe, do I remember correctly? I remember you telling me something about what really set that aircraft apart was its power plant. Is that an accurate statement?
It had CFM 56-2 engines. So it's the same CFM 56 that's on all the 737s, the plane you fly, the Airbus. However, it was like one of the first versions of the CFM 56. So it was a -2. So on my 707, it's a -7. On yours, I don't know what it is.
I wouldn't even know.
Dash something.
Yeah.
So it's a lot. It's more advanced. It puts out more thrust than the ones we had on the 707. So we had the -2, which is flat rated at 24,000 pounds of thrust at sea level, up to 35 degrees. You start losing thrust, and it was very reliable.
Yeah.
I went through CFM 56 line maintenance school in 1988 in August at Evansdale, Ohio, where they build that engine. And at the time, the company that builds that motor is actually called CFM, which stands for Commercial Fan Moteur, which is the French word for motor. And that was a joint conglomeration between GE, it still is, GE and Snecma of France, which is now called Safran. They call it Safran now, but it was called Snecma. And the two companies build that engine in coordination with each other. So GE builds the low pressure compressor, low pressure turbines, and the engine nacelles, and Safran builds the high pressure core engine.
Oh.
And then they ship the core engine, the high pressure compressor and turbine, to Evandale, Ohio, and that's where you have the final assembly of the engine. So I went through a 2-week course there, and the first day was really amazing because it was just a tour of the building, and it's like a mile-long building where they build all these, not just that engine, but all the GE engines. And it's incredible, the processes that we saw, which is like acid drip drilling, friction welding, and all these different processes that they use to build these engines. And then the next 2 weeks was just doing line maintenance on the CFM 56. So pulling fan blades, pulling the fuel controls, changing variable bleed valves, variable stator vane actuators, everything except actually tearing the engine apart. So anything you would do on the line that you could possibly do on the line is the training we got. So changing fuel injectors, changing thermocouples, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Everything but tearing the engine apart. I mean, like completely. So bore scoping the engine was training. All that kind of stuff that you could do. So I became a certified CFM 56 line tech, and that was a fun. It wasn't hard, but it was fun. A lot of fun, and a lot of people in the class were I had people from France. We had mechanics from Britain, mechanics from the Middle East, mechanics from everywhere. So it was like a conglomeration, and we all went out and partied together. And we had a really awesome time.
I can only imagine, my friend.
that was north of Cincinnati in Evansdale.
Yeah.
And so I had a blast doing that. And that engine was just so cool, man. It was just the most reliable. It's the smoothest engine compared to the C-130. The C-130, I was always fixing that plane, man. As a flight engineer, you're in charge of maintenance. So you go remotely deployed, and we deploy for like 2 weeks. Go to various stops. We had the flight engineer took charge of all the maintenance, and I was continuously fixing that plane. Every 2-week trip, we'd have like 8 or 9 legs, and we'd miss at least one for maintenance.
Oh wow!
Just go down because the plane would break, and continuously. I was always every flight I was fixing something. And that had to do with the air. So I took now the mission avionics was taken care of by the mission guys. So we had 2 avionics techs or avionic technicians mates. We call them ATs for their initials. We had 2 ATs, so 2 techs generally. Sometimes we'd have 3. We had 2 radio men on board. We had 2 reel operators in the back, which I used to be one. So the reel operators would fix the reel and maintain that. The techs would fix the power amplifier and all the radios and stuff. And they'd also fix the aircraft radar and some of the radios on the flight deck and all that. And then the flight engineers were in charge of all of that, and they had to fix everything else. So anything that went along with the engines or anything like that. So I was in charge of maintenance for 17 years of both the C-130 and the 707. So when we went out on these trips, it was our airplane, and now I owned it. And now I had to fix it. So we always left with toolboxes with us, roll around toolboxes, all our technical publications, which back then was not on any kind of electronic format.
Yeah, how many
so
hundreds of pounds
load
of books?
technical publication library, which weighed about 300 to 400 pounds of manuals that we would load into a special cabinet for that.
Yeah.
So that consisted of all the maintenance manuals for the airplane. And this was both for the C-130 and the 707. And so we were in charge of maintenance. So that's how I got all my experience working on airplanes as a mechanic, because I am a certified A&P mechanic as well, certified flight engineer, as well as pilot. And I got all my experience doing that, maintaining the C-130 and the 707. The C-130 just broke it. the reason the C-130 broke. Now, the C-130 is generally a reliable plane, but not the way we flew it. And the reason that is because we flew that airplane at max endurance all the time.
Yeah.
And what is max endurance? I mean, that's just another. You could fly long range cruise, you could fly max range cruise, you could fly max speed. There's different profiles you could use depending on how you want to fly. But we flew max endurance, which guaranteed that you would stay in the air the longest amount of time. It wasn't the longest range, but you would just hang in the air. And when you flew max endurance on the C-130, you had 10 degrees of pitch.
Oh, wow.
Continuously.
Wow, you're constantly uphill.
Everything now, yeah, but that's not the real problem. Just it's the inherent problem of the propellers. So on the C-130, you had a synchrophaser system, and the synchrophaser's job was to maintain the phase lag relationship between the blades, so that when a blade passed each other on one wing, they didn't pass exactly at the same point. One blade would come by, and then the other one would come by, because if you allowed them to pass each other like that, it would set up a sonic wave, and that sonic wave would create a vibration that would just it would be incredible.
Oh, wow. It's kind of like a
fact,
zipper.
If the synchrophaser was inoperative, we were limited to only 8 hours of flying.
Oh, wow.
And then it had to be fixed. It was MEL-able, but you could maintenance, minimum equipment list.
Yeah.
But there was
deferred.
limitations to that. So only 8 hours, and then you had to land, because after that it was just going to really vibrate the plane apart. But so you had a synchrophaser to deal with that. But that did absolutely nothing for P factor. And when you're hanging with 10 degrees of pitch, and those blades are taking big chunks of big bites of air on the downstroke, you're getting P factor.
Right.
And there's nothing the synchrophaser or anything else can do about it. And the plane is just vibrating the whole time. Now, it's not as bad as if the synchrophaser fails. But that was the lifetime limiting factor on our C-130s. And when they retired all of the C-130s, I think we had 16 or 18 of them. 16 mission birds. Only 3 of them were usable.
Wow. Yeah. And now, does the Navy still use this reel antenna to communicate, or are we using more modern equipment today?
All that mission equipment was stuck on the 707. And it stayed on there for 7 years until 1997, when we went from the A model to the B model. And then we went to the B model, and the major upgrade to the major change to the B model 707 was yanking out all that old mission equipment and reinstalling new stuff.
Oh, okay. Is it all satellite-based equipment now, or is it something more?
No, mostly it was kind of the same as it was before, but it's just upgraded and much more modern.
Yeah.
And designed more for the 707 instead of the stuff that they just yanked out of the C-130.
Okay.
And they also installed an Air Force battle staff, which was their previous mission was called Looking Glass. And Looking Glass was our counterpart in the Air Force. So the Navy maintained command and control of the ballistic missile nuclear submarine fleet, and we were that communication link for that.
Mm-hmm.
The Air Force maintains command and control of the bombers and the silos, which is what they operate. They're the ones who operate that. And during the Cold War, we had a plane in the air 24 hours a day, which is where I got most of my flight time in the Navy, was doing that. Because we had a plane 24 hours a day. You always have coverage. We had a plane in the air, one over the Atlantic and one over the Pacific. So VQ4 handled the Atlantic and PQ3 handled the Pacific. So continuously, that's no easy feat to do that, especially when each squadron that does that only has 8 airplanes. So it was tough to do that, and it was a lot of work. And that was one of the reasons why we had to be self-sufficient with maintenance on the aircraft. That's why the flight engineers fixed the airplane and were in charge of maintenance. We had to be independent of any place we went. So we'd go to a lot of random stops during these trips, and most of them were Air Force bases and stuff. But we weren't allowed to let them work on our aircraft. We couldn't ask them to, like, if we had to change an engine or a prop or something like that. You don't ask the Air Force to do that. You do it yourself, and you get logistic support from the airport, like maybe engine slings or some of the tools that you don't have, or maybe a crane or something to lift the engine or the prop off the plane. You could do that, but you couldn't allow them to come in and work on it. You had to be able to do it. Why? That was training for us. We had to be able to fix our own airplane, and the whole purpose of that was a post-nuclear war environment. So we had to be survivable. We had to be self-sufficient, and
Right.
we were. So that made our job a whole hell of a lot harder, because after a 3-hour pre-flight, 12-hour flight, and a 2-hour post-flight, which involved unloading fuel up to, on the 707, was you could unload 120,000 pounds.
Wow.
And that took some time. We were remotely deployed. We had to fix our own airplane. So it was a lot of work. But the benefit of that is I knew that airplane like the back of my hand. I'd take it apart and put it back together. And it was pretty tough.
Yeah.
It's a lot of work. And I had many 24-hour days flying and fixing. Flying and fixing, flying and fixing. Sometimes I'd fix planes in flight. I would take autopilots apart in flight on the C-130 and the 707, repair them, and put it back. And once they were reinstalled, I'd reset the circuit breakers and tell the pilots, "All right, try it now." They just turn it on.
Yeah. So you're
So,
literally up there in flight with freaking tools in your hand.
I'd fix, I'd be repairing stuff in flight. In the Navy, we could do whatever we wanted. It wasn't like we were limited by the FARs or anything. I mean, the pilots had to comply with FARs when they were flying in U.S. airspace.
Sure.
But maintenance-wise, I didn't do whatever I wanted. I didn't have to have a license in the Navy. I didn't get my A&P license till after I retired, and my flight engineer license, I didn't get it till the end of my career.
So when you're in the military, you're trained, you're certified within the ranks of the military and their hierarchy.
Yeah, we have our own
not
certification system.
Yeah, so when you come out, you
separate.
physically have to go and do the testing to get certified by the FAA for the equivalent.
Yeah,
so
you got to jump through all the hoops. Pilots too. Pilots could, they could get years, decades of military qualifications and training and all that, but if they don't get any civilian licenses, they can't. They're not any more qualified to fly any airplanes than anyone else. So they have to go convert that experience to civilian, certification. And that was one of the jobs I did as a flight instructor. When I became a pilot, I became a CFI, CFII, and MEI.
Mm-hmm.
And I stood up an ATP training program at Galvin Flying Services at Boeing Field. And I created this program from the ground up to train pilots or to get pilots ready for their ATP check rides.
So let's talk about that a little bit. So you left the military service in the year 1999, is that correct?
Yep, retired out of Tinker.
And what did you do? What was the
Phoenix.
process from leaving the military service into a civilian aviation? Because at that point, you weren't rated to be a pilot. How did you transition? What schooling did you do?
Well, I had no pilot certifications from the military. I wasn't a pilot. I was a flight engineer, and as an enlisted person, I was never going to be a pilot in the Navy. This just was not going to happen.
Right.
And so what I did was, when I got out, when I retired, the first thing I did was finish up my college, because when I was doing all that testing, bringing the 707 in the fleet, that was shore duty. So on my free time, I went to college at Emery Riddle at the extended campus at Patuxent River, and I started my bachelor's of science there with them. And I got about 8 or 9 courses done there. And then I went back to VQ4 after I was done my tour, and I was just flying far too much to be able to do anything after that. Operationally, I was just flying a lot.
Yeah.
I had a lot of stuff going on, so I didn't have time. So the first thing I did when I retired was get my bachelor's finished up with Emery Riddle, and I did it at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix.
Oh, yeah.
So that was the extended campus there. I didn't use Emery Riddle for flight training. I just used them for my academic degree.
Ah, okay.
And I got my major in professional aeronautics and my minor in aviation safety. So once that was out of the way, I wanted to become a professional flight engineer. And the difference between a professional flight engineer and a second officer is that a second officer is a qualified pilot. They have gone through all the pilot training. They have all their certifications. and they were just unlucky enough to bid as a flight engineer. They didn't have the seniority to sit in the right seat or the left seat. Their seniority was a flight engineer. And it worked like any other position on the flight deck between first officer and captain. You just had a bid status as a flight engineer.
Mm-hmm.
That was your bid status. And if you were senior enough, you could become a pilot. So I wasn't doing that because I wasn't a pilot. So I had to be a professional flight engineer. So the companies that hired them was like ATI, Polar Air Cargo, Atlas, Evergreen, Challenge Air Cargo. A lot of these cargo carriers that are not FedEx, not UPS, or DHL, or any of those companies, because those guys hired second officers as flight engineers. And the difference is the flight engineer, professional flight engineer, you don't need to have any pilot qualifications. You just be a flight engineer. They always wanted you to have an AMP license, which is the reason I got that, was to become a professional flight engineer, because that was a requirement. And I got that. So I wanted to do that, and that was around May of '91. And I wasn't going to become a flight engineer. I mean, FedEx had just got awarded the contract from the post office that all these other cargo carriers had. There was a regulation that forced the post office to diversify their airmail feed to all these different cargo carriers. Well, that regulation was removed either by Clinton or Bush. I don't know who did it. But once that regulation was removed, the post office was forced to give all their business to FedEx. And then all these other cargo carriers were taking it in the shorts because they lost all this business. So they were either had a hiring freeze on. They were furloughing. I think Atlas furloughed 104, Evergreen furloughed 60. And so they were either doing that or going out of business. Challenge Air folded, and a few others folded. So I sent out 34 resumes, and I didn't get one single return, nothing. Well, Omni Air did send me an acknowledgement letter. Hey, we got your resume. Have a nice day. And that was it. It took me about a month to figure out what happened. And once I figured that out, I didn't waste any time. I went right into pilot training. So I started from 0 hours as a pilot and went all the way through flight instructor in 10 months in Phoenix.
And this was in Phoenix? Was that IATA, is it, in Glendale?
Yeah, IATA, International Airline Training Academy, also known as the Global Group. And that company folded after 9/11. But it was run by a retired Pan Am captain. And it was an international school. So when I went, it was interesting because all the flight instructors there were all from all over the world: France, Britain, England, Germany, Central America, South America, the Middle East. I mean, they were everywhere. There was 3 instructors there from the U.S.
Oh, wow.
And at the time, prior to 9/11, the United States is the place to go for flight instruction because it was the least expensive place to go. And so all these international students are coming to the United States for flight training. Well, I went down there for flight training. And that's where my school was. And I got exposed to all these guys, and it was really a fantastic experience to be able to fly with them and learn how to fly from them. They taught me how to fly. So my private pilot instructor was Eric Englander. He was from Germany, and he did my private pilot training. And I got my check ride from Brunhilde Bradley. They called her Bruni. And she was a little petite little woman, little grandma, very, very timid till she got in the cockpit. And then it was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. She just badgered the living hell out of me for like the entire
You call
check
yourself
ride.
a pilot? That's wonderful.
Christ, man. That was when I learned about DPEs and the various different quirks that they can have.
Yeah.
And that was what shaped my view of designated pilot examiners and how quirky some of them are.
Yeah, very true.
And it also became a very important lesson for me when I became a flight instructor as to who I was sending my students to. So I very much regarded that because I had a lot of trouble with DPEs, some of them. I mean, I had one guy give me a pink slip because he didn't like the way my flight school trained me for ILSs. He says, well, at the end of the check, I walk it back. I'm like, I'm shattered. It's like failed the check ride. And This guy goes, "Oh, I'm not giving you the pink slip. I'm giving it to your flight school." I said, "No, you're not.
Oh my
You're
God.
giving it to me." And then I go in for my makeup flight with the same guy, and he just gives me the freaking license right there. He says, "Don't worry about it."
Oh
My
my God.
flight school called the FAA on him.
Yeah.
So a couple of days later, I show up at the flight school, and there's 3 FAA examiners there, and I go through the entire story of what happened with them, and they asked me, he says, "If you would you take your check ride again?" I said, "Absolutely." I think they reversed that. I think they pulled that, and
Yeah.
and I don't know what they did to that guy, but they probably spanked him.
Yeah. I've heard some stories
But,
too
I mean,
about
I ran
DEs
it
and whatnot. Yeah. It's a shame.
when I became a flight instructor, I made sure, mostly in Seattle, I had most of my students. I never had a student flunk a check ride. Never. I was a Gold SEAL flight instructor. I was a NAFI master, and all of my students passed. All of them.
Yeah.
And usually with flying
when
colors.
you graduated there in Phoenix area, and you ended up, didn't you go to New Jersey first for a little while, and then
I after in August of 2002, I moved to New Jersey, and I started flying for American Flyers out of Morristown, and I flew for them for about 10 months.
Yeah.
I didn't really like them that much, and if I would have stayed in New Jersey, I would have found another flight school to work for.
But what life happens, and you ended up in Seattle, Washington.
Yeah, I wound up
working out at Boeing.
moving to Seattle because I had gotten divorced in Phoenix, and my ex moved back to Seattle. And I met her during the time I was doing testing with Boeing in 1988 and 1990. That's when I met her.
Mm-hmm.
I like to put it, that's where I met my last ex-wife. But you know, when I was in New Jersey, I realized I couldn't stay there because my you know, my kids life was happening with my kids, and I couldn't be there for them. So they were having issues, and I'm like stuck in New Jersey. I couldn't do anything about it. Now, I had them come out to visit me when I was there, but that's not the same thing. And I went out to visit them. I realized very quickly that I wasn't going to be able to have any peace of mind with me in New Jersey and them in Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
So I told my partner at the time, I told her that I just couldn't stay, and she was completely supportive of that. She understood it completely.
Yeah. Please stay with us. We'll be right back after a brief word from our sponsors.
And I moved to Seattle the next summer to be with the kids, and I've been in that area ever since. So that was 2003, and so I was there for them when they grew as they grew up, all the time. And as a flight instructor, I was there continuously because I could cut my own schedule. Mm-hmm. So, but after I joined SPR, what's that airline?
Sandpiper Regional, my friend.
Sandpiper Regional,
Yep.
SPR. And after joining SPR, my schedule, of course, I wasn't there as much, but I was still there.
Yeah. And so you got hired, I remember, August of 2006, and I was in December of 2006. Our stories, when it comes to, you know, you moving to the Phoenix area, getting your flight instructor, you seem to just be a couple of years ahead of me. I did the same thing. I went to Pan Am Flight Academy over in Deer Valley on the north side of the Metroplex.
I don't know how you tolerated that.
You know, it was, and I've spoken about this before on previous episodes. It was a farm. You know, you just showed up, you did the coursework that you're supposed to do, and it's always a different instructor, and you're in this little bubble. And because I was a little older, going through the process, I wasn't some, 18-year-old fresh out of high school kid. I already had my degree and completed college, and I already was established in a profession for over a decade. And deciding to change profession to become a pilot, I decided to pick a school that was going to just get me through the quickest possible way so that I can get my feet into the door of the industry as soon as possible. And I chose that program. It was, in hindsight, if I were to do it over again, and the advice I give young aviators is not to go that route. There are better, more productive ways of doing it that are much less financially burdened.
They were a mill, man.
Yeah.
I actually, after I got my private, I actually went over there for a week. Deer Valley was closer to where I lived than Glendale was.
Mm-hmm.
So I went over there for a week, and I realized after just a day or two that this place had serious issues, and I wasn't going to stay.
Yeah.
And after a week, I mean, the instructors were just completely unprofessional. They had no clue what they were talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm coming out of the military with 20 years of flying experience, extensive flying experience.
Talk about
and
polar
stuff
opposites.
like that. And I'm listening to some of the stuff they're saying and going, oh my gosh.
No.
And I intimidated the hell out of one of my ground school instructors. She was just a young kid, brand spank. I don't even think she was a CFI yet. She was just one of the people they stuck in the class as an instructor. So she was working toward her CFI, and some of the stuff she was saying, I don't know. My biggest problem with that class was just raising my hand and asking questions or making statements,
Mm-hmm.
and so I really intimidated the hell out of her. And it got to the point where if I raised my hand, she would look at me with an utter look of horror.
Fear. What?
And I realized I couldn't stay there in that environment, and so did the staff there. And they called me into the office one day and they said, "Hey, man, you know, it looks to us like you're not that happy here."
Oh, jeez.
And I said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm not." They said, "Your instructor says that you're disrupting her class." And I looked at them directly in the eye and I said, "You're absolutely right. I am disrupting her class. And let me tell you how I'm doing that. I'm asking questions." And so, yeah, I'm disrupting the class because she can't handle these questions, and she doesn't know that much. She doesn't have any experience, and and it's just not going to work out. I can't have an instructor that has no idea what they're talking about instructing me. It's just not going to work.
And when you're paying
if
that,
they were on,
come on.
yeah, and I'm so I said, "Look, I agree with you. I'm not happy here." And they said, "No problem. We're going to refund all your money if you have no problem with that." And Pan Am had that financial restriction that they would keep like $2,000 or 10% of your account there.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, "We're not going to do that. We'll just give you back all your money
They don't
if
want
you want
trouble.
to just you want to just walk out." And I said, "Yeah, I want to do that. I absolutely wanted to do that. I couldn't stand it."
Yeah.
The one thing that really pissed me off about is they let the coffee mess run dry in the student coffee mess. I was really upset about that. I mean, come on.
You take
what kind of
if you don't have coffee on demand for a pilot in a training environment, you're just asking for trouble.
I had to go to the administrative coffee mess to get coffee, which was another building away. So I would walk across the parking lot, go to their building, walk in there, and just take their coffee. And they didn't like that.
I think you and I had recurrent training at Sandpiper one year, and it was early on when we knew each other, and I think we were traveling from Seattle to Dallas for recurrent training, and I was like, "Why do you have a coffee mug? He's like, "Oh, it's free coffee." I'm like, "What? I've been paying $1 at the vending machine at every break at the training center." He's like, "Oh no, you go downstairs. You got the sim maintenance room back there.
Yeah.
You just leave $1 in the pot and you can get fresh coffee." And I was like, "What?"
Downstairs at the academy, they had the sim maintenance coffee mess, and it was open to everybody, but none of the pilots knew about it.
Right.
I knew about it from 10 years earlier when I was doing 707 flight training. And I didn't get to that yet, but we had 2 old 707s we brought from Air Portugal in the Navy, and they were beaters, man. They were old. They weren't the systems weren't anything like the new E6s. We brought them from Air Portugal. They were 707 320Bs or Cs, I think. I don't remember exactly what they had. JT3D engines, and they had all the systems were so removed that it was a separate qualification for flight engineers. So for the longest time, the Navy used contract flight engineers to do the pilot training. So it was actually Navy pilots that were dual qualified, but the flight engineers were contractors, defense contractors. The last defense contractor, I think, was L3 Communications. They changed contractors every 5 years there. So 1 year it's L3Com, next year it's Raytheon, next year it's somebody else.
Sure.
It's usually the same people. They usually have to redo their health plans. But anyway, So they were using these contractors for the 707, and I was the first U.S. Navy flight engineer, active duty military flight engineer qualified on that airplane. And the simulators we used for that, we had our own simulators at the schoolhouse at NTSU there at Tinker for the E6s, but they weren't adequate. They weren't. You couldn't use them for training on the 707 because the plane was just so different.
Mm-hmm.
We called it the Jurassic Jet because it looked like it. You had trouble pressurizing it because it leaked so much. You didn't dare pull the thrust levers back too far up at altitude, otherwise the plane was just going to depressurize. And because it was leaking so bad.
Wow.
We wasn't going to fix it, and but it was fun, man. I loved that airplane, and we would do our training at the Legacy Airlines because they had the last simulator in the country for the last 707 flight simulator in the country.
Yeah,
that's where we did it. So that was my first exposure there at the schoolhouse, and the people I went down there. That's when I started using the coffee mess. So that was like in 1995, 1996, 1997.
Here you are a decade later as a pilot.
So a decade later, when I come back to the same academy for Sandpiper, I just go right back down to the same coffee mess.
It's still there.
Yeah, because it's still there, right? Yeah. So I use it. So that was 10 years later. And what do we do now? I don't know what we do now.
Well, now it was a different facility when we left, but now it.
Yeah. Well, that's still there. That coffee mess is still there. I used it the last time I was there.
Oh, did you go down there?
So that was. Yeah, that was. What was that? January, I think.
Yeah, the most. You just reminded me of this. The most amazing experience was my first day of the Airbus ground school, which the ground school at Legacy Airlines, they pair you up with another pilot and you go in. It's one-on-one with an instructor. You have a mock-up or computer with the touch screen LG big, kind of like you used to have Paper Tiger we used to sit in front of and imagine flipping switches. Well, here you had 2 touchscreen computer screens with a center pedestal and some office chairs that you would just push up there, and you would learn your triggers and your flows, and you would go through your scenario based lessons. And I am sitting there in the training facility for Legacy Airlines, what we call here the employer that we're at right now, Squawk Ident, and I'm in the same classroom on my very first day of ground school for the Airbus that I was 13, 14 years earlier for my very first day at Sandpiper Regional, my first airline job, because at the time those were all Sandpiper classrooms, and then Sandpiper got their own facility on the other side of the airport, and they have now their own training center, their own offices and whatnot. They moved out after the big merger because they needed classroom space. So it was just an amazing event. And here I am telling my naval pilot that was a new hire with me, who I partnered up with for ground school, telling him, hey man, I know where to get coffee. It's downstairs. I tell you, I'll hook you up. So it's all full circle, these experiences that we've had. It all started with you back in the 90s, just visiting to get some time in a 707 sim that would suit the
I spent a lot
needs.
of time in that 707 simulator, and it was kind of interesting too. The story. My first day at Sandpiper, we were in the 707 classroom right across the hall from that simulator.
Nice.
And that hall is a tiny hallway. I mean, you trip coming out of the 707 classroom, and you fall into the 707 simulator bay. But at that time, they had removed the 707 simulator out of there for 2 years at that point. And my interview sim ride with Sandpiper was in the Saab.
Oh.
So, but when they had the 707 simulator, everybody was interviewing in that simulator. That's where Sandpiper was interviewing people. So there's a lot of people I flew. Oh yeah, I got my check. I got my interview sim ride in that simulator.
Yeah, and I remember mine too. It was in the Fokker because the Fokker sim was open that day. And just to give these any aspiring pilots out there a heads up of they're like, wait a minute, you were in a 707 sim for your interview at a regional? What, at least at the time, Sandpiper was doing, the alias to the regional that we used to fly for, was you'd have a simulator, or you'd have first day would be like your HR interview. You take a short like
Yeah, in
ATP
the
50
morning.
question test just to make sure you kind of have a good idea, because you didn't have to have an ATP back then. You just had to be a commercially rated pilot.
Right.
And if you had your ATP written completed, great. And then they just gave you kind of like a short quiz just to make sure that you're up and up on that. And if you pass all that and answer the questions and get the whole panel interview completed with a couple line pilots, line check airmen that were there, ask you a couple questions just to make sure that you get your head on straight and everything. Then the second part of the day, they ask you to go downstairs to the sim bay, and they just wanted to make sure that you could hand fly an airplane, shoot an ILS with a glass cockpit. Because
Right.
if they are hiring somebody without previous glass cockpit experience, they just wanted to make sure that you've done your homework, you've come prepared, and you can fly an ILS with the crossbars on a PFD, and you weren't going to be completely lost. Because if you've never seen anything like that before, then maybe you're not ready. So, we all just would jump into the whatever sim was available for that time frame for that part of the interview. And it's just amazing to hear that, you had people that were in the 707, and, you got into the Saab, and I got in the Fokker, airplanes that I never touched before and since, but it's just a process that they were doing. Now, the process, once, we're starting to hire again after this kind of craziness with this pandemic is going to subside, which it will, then we'll find out how they're going to rejoin the interview process in the future. But I don't think they were doing sim interviews or even anything more than HR and very short technical interviews before all this happened. So I'll be curious to see if they get into that. So Sandpiper Regional is where we met, as we mentioned. I think at the time I was living over in University Place, just west of Tacoma there on the Sound. And yeah, we were commuting in together a few times. That's where we met. We were both Chicago-based pilots for Sandpiper. We got to share a couple commuting nightmare stories. I remember.
Oh yeah.
Those were the days where you walked up to the gate and there were 5 pilots on an oversold flight and vying for 1 or possibly 2 jump seats, and they're like, okay, well, you were here first, so you go first, you go second, this person will go third, and we didn't know each other. We just kind of had a gentleman's agreement, I'd like to call it. And okay, well, 2 pilots get on, and the rest of them all walk to the next gate because there's another flight in 30 minutes on another carrier. And okay, you were there first last time, so okay, you're next, and then we'll go. It was like the best way of doing it. And sometimes it took 2 or 3 times before you got on a flight actually to get to work. So you spent half a day
gate surfing.
Yeah, gate surfing for sure. And of course, there was always someone occasionally that made their own rules and didn't want to follow these, practices, because it's not written anywhere. It's just kind of an etiquette that, because if someday you're trying to get on a jump seat and that pilot that you just cut off and got in front of, no, you're not in my jump seat, sorry. So yeah, we learned all about that pretty quick together. What are some of the early experiences you had now flying in a civilian environment? So here you were after 20 years in the military, having experiences that we haven't even scratched the surface with. And now, after flight instruction and academics and all that, now here you are flying for a civilian commercial airline. Or what was that like? Was that a big adjustment for you?
Well, that was 20 years of military and then 5 years of general aviation, which is a little over 4 years of that was flight instruction. So the one thing, not the one thing, but the thing that was different about all 3 of those was that all 3 of them were different. So the military was one kind of flying. Coming into the general aviation field from the military is completely foreign concept. I mean, there was so much that I learned going into general aviation. I was staggered at the amount of information I didn't know when I went in there. After flying for 20 years in C-130s and 707s, I was staggered by what I didn't know. and I just kind of soaked it all in as much as possible. And then when I became a flight instructor, that helped me understand it even more, because the best way to understand something is to teach it. And maybe not the best way, but one of the best ways. And then going into the airlines, again, it was a completely new world to me. And I just remember, pushing off the gate for the first time there in Chicago off the G gates, that I had no clue what the hell I was doing, man. I mean, it was just kind of overwhelming to me. And this is after 25 years of flying. So it was completely different. And the IOE captain that I had with me, she hated me. She freaking hated me. I don't know why. It's just a personality conflict. And I've had that before, That wasn't unfamiliar. But why did it have to happen on the first damn flight out of the,
Yeah.
She just didn't like me. She was freaking yelling at me at the top of her lungs sometimes.
Maybe you reminded her of
and
her
I freaking was about ready to quit, man. I told her when she calmed down that this was not acceptable. You don't talk to me like that. You got a problem with me? We're just not going to fly together.
Wow.
I don't care who you are. I waited for her to finish, and when she was done, I go, "Are you finished?" And then I fucking went into her, and I didn't raise my voice at her. I just told her, "You're not going to talk to me like that.
Yeah.
I'm not going to put up with that.
Hmm.
You talk to me."
And here he is. You're on IOE. You're trying to make a good impression. And
the only thing I could think of is I might have intimidated her, because here I am coming in there with 25 years. But what she didn't realize is she despised me. She didn't like me at all. I don't know why. I really could never really figure that out. And that's the way personality conflicts work.
Mm-hmm.
You never really know why the other person doesn't like you. They just don't. And then you don't like the other person because of that.
Yeah.
Whether you like that person or not, whether your initial impression of them was good, their
Yeah.
initial impression of you wasn't good.
Right.
And so that's what I had. So I was about ready to quit. And then my next check airman, he was an asshole too.
Wow. Yeah.
I also had I had two of them, so I was about ready to quit at that point. But I got through it, and I continued. And then when I started flying with these people, I realized that it was just them. It wasn't really me.
Yeah.
They just didn't like me for whatever reason. Because everybody else, not everybody else, but most of the other people I flew with, I just had a random, and that's the way it worked with check rides and things like that. I mean, it's all completely random. You get a really good person that's good, and you're not going to have any issues.
Right.
And you get a bad person, an IOE person who's not good, or you have a personality conflict, and there's absolutely nothing you could do to save your check ride or whatever it is you're going through.
Yeah.
There's nothing.
You just have to.
It's not going to happen.
Yeah. You just have to
That's the
focus
way
on what you're doing and do your best.
TPEs are now 20 years of the military. I never flunked anything.
Yeah.
I was always good. That doesn't mean I never had any problems. I did the first time I went on a deployment in 1980 as a rail operator, a brand new rail operator, the lowest ranking person on the plane. I was sitting in the back. My job was to make sure everybody had a beer by the time the engines came out of reverse thrust on landing. That was the way it was.
Do you have the cooler right next to you?
And
you're like, all right,
I was
here you go.
good at it.
That's the best job I ever had.
But the person who was in charge, the first real operator, he was giving another guy a check ride. So, and both of them treated me like crap. I thought it was normal. I mean, here I am, a 20-year-old kid, first flying, and I'm getting treated like shit. I didn't realize it.
Yeah.
And for the first 4 deployments of my career, it was crap, man. This guy, they treated me like crap. I'm not going to go into the details. But when I went to the next crew,
yeah,
it was like night and day.
Was it like a hazing thing where you're new?
No.
So the new guy?
No. There was a little bit of that, but they were too obsessed with just not liking me, period.
Yeah.
So I don't know what it was, but the next crew I went with, the difference was like night and day, and I realized that there was definitely an issue. And during, those first 4 trips, the aircraft commander came up to me one day and he said, Airman Meltzer, it looks like you're having some kind of a personality conflict with your first position, the first reel operator. So I was like the second reel, and he was the first reel. He says, I would recommend that when you get back from this deployment that you talk to schedules and ask them to put you on another crew because you're having and to me, the whole concept of a personality conflict was new to me. And I kind of understood what he was talking about, but I didn't really take it to heart too much. And I stayed on that crew for another trip. And so it was just as bad.
Yeah.
And then when I got onto the next crew, I realized what he was talking about, because the next crew wasn't like that. I mean, my first position was really cool. I enjoyed flying with them. And from that point on, I realized what the problem was and what it really actually meant to have a personality conflict with someone.
Yeah, and that's a question I usually reserve for towards the end of the show, where I kind of go through those fast-paced interview questions. But since we're talking about it, let's kind of dive into it. And the question is, in all your years of experience, what is the way that you found is the best way to deal with personality conflicts in the cockpit?
Yeah, I've had my share of those, and I've seen a lot of them. I've seen conflicts turn into heated yelling matches between pilots and other crew members.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen that more than once.
Yeah.
I came close to that myself with other crew members, but never really reached the worst levels that I've seen. I was always able to kind of curtail it. Either I curtailed it, the other person curtailed it. And the best way to deal with it is to realize going in, before you fly with anyone, that the potential exists to have a personality conflict with them. So you go in there not expecting anything. You go in there with an open book, consideration that not everybody's going to share your views with you. We're all different. We may be, the only thing that we have in common is that we're pilots and we're flying airplanes and we work for the same company. Beyond that, we don't have any commonalities. Now, you and I have a lot of commonalities, and that's probably why we're friends. But it's just not going to be the case with everyone. And you don't have to respect another person's differences. You don't have to respect what their beliefs are. You don't have to respect their ideas or anything like that. But what you do need to respect is that they have them. They're entitled to them, and they're not going to be like yours. And that's fine. That's fine with me. I don't really care what somebody's politics are, what their religion is, what their sexual preferences are, what their gender orientation is. None of that makes any difference to me. The only thing I care about when I'm flying with somebody is how well I get along with them, how well they're willing to, work with me. In either seat, left or right seat, it doesn't matter. It's the same.
Yeah.
That's what I base somebody on: how friendly they are to me, how well they regard me. Now, if they start out and they're tense and they're, and they treat you, I've been yelled at by first officers almost as much as I've been yelled at from captains.
Yeah. In this day and age, I hear that,
yeah,
more and more.
So you and I actually had, you know about some of the conflicts I had at Sandpiper, because you were involved in it. You were made involved in one of them, significant. Mm-hmm. And sometimes there's nothing you could do but resolve yourself to the fact that you're just not going to be able to fly with somebody.
Very true.
It's just not going to happen. You have to realize that's going to get there. And the longer you fly, the more of a chance that can happen. And it may not happen at all. In the 20 years in the Navy, I got off of one crew once because I could take it. Even as badly as I was treated on the first 4 trips,
mm-hmm.
After that, I resolved myself to never be treated like that again. I would just never let it happen. So I always had an eye open for that.
I think that's
that
kind
was
of
gonna-
key. You kind of hit the nail on the head. Is
Yeah.
especially when you're new. You're coming into
Yeah.
a regional or any scenario
Yeah.
where you're new at a potential employer and you want to, try and experience and have a good time. You got first know your audience. Do your best to know that you don't know that person. Who knows what they could have been going through that day? There's some traumatic
Exactly.
experience could have happened to them, and you just happen to
Right.
be in the fire. You're
Yeah.
on their trajectory for their current situation. So sometimes you just have to back away from that, like you mentioned, and just realize that you don't have to be best friends to fly together. You just have to be professional, courteous, respectful,
Exactly.
and fly in a safe manner using standard operating procedures or SOPs, and
Yeah.
manipulating the CRMs to the point where at the end of the day, you're going to operate in a safe environment, and you may never see them again, and that's okay. You don't
Right.
have to end up being, pen pals after the flight. So
No, you don't.
no, and thank you for sharing that. That's a very
Yeah.
very good point. And I kind of got away from asking that quite a bit because some people they're like, oh, I get along with everybody, and it's like, okay.
Yeah.
But
That's
you're flying with strangers,
Sure.
and though we share a commonality of a passion for aviation, sometimes personalities just don't mesh, and that's okay. But you just have to get professional and past
Exactly.
it, and if
Yeah.
you have to remove yourself from the situation,
Right.
that might be the healthier way to
As
go.
long
Sometimes.
as long as you don't walk into the flight deck with expectations, other than the other person is qualified, they're trained, and you both want to fly. So I mean, you can
Right.
add some semantics to that, but you don't have any expectations about who they are, what their politics are, or any of the other personal details of somebody's characteristic. I don't really care what they are, as long as they're not, serial killers or pedophiles or anything like that. And
Right.
as far as I know, I've never flown with anybody like that. So
Right.
you have to just have an open mind, an open book. There's three things I don't talk about on the flight deck. That's sex, religion, and politics. Those are the three. I just don't do that.
And depending on where you're
unless-
based, guns.
Now,
Don't talk
now
about guns.
I'm not going to bring it up. That doesn't mean I absolutely won't comment on it or talk about it.
Right.
But if somebody who I know, like you, I know what your politics are, I know what your religion is. You and I can have that conversation because we've already had it, and it's not going to be a conflict. We already know that we can have a rational conversation about a lot of that.
Right. And
It's
because
not
we
gonna
know each other, I
digress.
won't be offended at the onset of the
Exactly.
conversation. Right. Right.
Right. And so
The only thing
I
I'm
know you-
offended of is people that get offended. So
You just want a bitch slap.
just
So-
saying, in a nice way.
The outrage culture.
So, here you are, you're, flying along, you upgrade, now you're a captain at Sandpiper. And can you remember a time at Sandpiper when you had an in-flight emergency and that, like off the top of your head, and how did you handle it?
Yeah. They were usually, how many? I've had several. They were usually all minor. I would consider minor. I had a bleeder overheat once, coming out of someplace in the Midwest, and I just landed 100 miles later. And it turned out to be a false indication. I've had, I'm trying to remember, they kind of all blend. I had, this one significant one. I had coming out of Dallas, going to Joplin. I was the first officer, so I was in the right seat in the 145. And prior to getting into Joplin, there was thunderstorms over Joplin, and there was a line that was just moving over Joplin. So we requested holding for about 15 minutes. And judging from how fast that line was moving, we figured that's all we would need if we needed that.
Mm.
And we were up at 370. So we got into we requested holding pattern on course, and they just gave us a point right in front of us to just go directly into a hold, and just hold until the thunderstorms pass, and then we just descend and land. But we did it up at 370. We slowed to our holding speed, but we entered IMC, and prior to the holding point. There wasn't any storms or anything, but it was IMC, so everything was obscured. And whenever I go up to IMC at altitude, I'm always watching the airspeeds, just for any kind of blocked PDOT tubes.
Mm-hmm.
And I was flying. I was the pilot flying, and so everything was coupled to my side. And just standard entry and direct entry and a direct entry into the hold, right? Start the 180-degree turn, and so I'm cross-checking airspeed because I always do that. And I start to see just a minor split between the airspeeds.
Mm.
The first knot or two, I really didn't say anything. When it got past 3 knots, and it wasn't a sudden and abrupt split, it was just a nice slow. As we were progressing into the turn, it was getting worse and worse. So I expected a little bit just from the turn, but then it just kept going. It got to about 3 knots, 4 knots, and that's when I said something to the captain. I said, "Hey, Captain, I'm seeing an airspeed, whoever he was, I'm seeing an airspeed split between the right and left side, and it looks to me like the standby indicator is matching your side. So I'm going to assume that I have something going on with my airspeed indication. So we just need to keep an eye on it." And after that, it just continued to split farther and farther at about the same slow rate. And when it hit about 5 knots a split, that's when we got a comparator warning for airspeed indication.
Right.
5 or 6 knots, whatever it was in the Embraer.
Mm-hmm.
So the comparator indication appeared, because that's when it sensed it.
Right.
And that was about a minute after I noticed it happening. So, and we got to about, it was obviously 180-degree turn entering the hold. And once we came out of that turn, now we were pointing the other way, and the airspeed split about 7 or 8 knots and wings level. And so now we know we have a problem. So we tell air traffic control we have an instrument problem with the airspeed, and we just want to leave the hold at this heading right now. Because it's perfect, because it's 180 degrees out of IMC, right? So we know we're leaving IMC. And I kind of figured it was high altitude crystal icing clogging up the PDOT tube on my side, which is the same thing that happened to Air France 447. And the same thing that happened to me in the Navy at least once.
Mm-hmm.
At least once. And those are all attributable to weak PDOT tube heaters. So basically the ice crystals build up in the PDOT tube at a rate that's higher than the heater can actually melt the ice,
Right.
and it just becomes blocked. And at some point the heater's going to catch up, and it's going to melt the ice, and it'll just come out the little weep hole in the back of the PDOT tube, and you'll be good, right?
Right.
Usually that's what happens.
Usually.
Usually, but not with this one. We accumulated so much high altitude crystalline icing. My airspeed, after we rolled out, my airspeed continued to drop off, and the captain's was fine.
Wow.
So, and the standby was fine. So so I suspect right off the bat I got a weak PDOT tube heater. And that's usually what it is. And that was Air France 447 had an AD out on that airplane for weak PDOT tube heaters for all the Airbus fleet at that time. And some of them were taken care of. That one wasn't. They hadn't gotten to the AD yet. Their airworthiness directive. They hadn't repaired that airplane yet, which was really all it is just doing a current check on the PDOT tube heater. So you do a current check, see how much current it's drawing. If it's not drawing enough current within a specific limit that's actually outlined, between this many amps and this many amps, you change it. It's real simple.
Yep.
That's how you check the PDOT tube heater. It's a simple freaking electrical test. Or you just measure the resistance of the heater with an ohmmeter. You disconnect it and put an ohmmeter on it, see what the resistance, and there should be a certain value. It's a really simple check. And if it's not good, you just swap out the PDOT tube, put in a different one. And so my airspeed continues to drop off on my side, and we decide, give you the airplane. So I transferred control over the captain because he had the good airspeed indication, switched the flight director over that. But that didn't really matter because the airspeed just continued to drop off. And at about 20 knots, we started getting IOW ICAS messages, which is the weight on wheel switches, which is kind of peculiar until you understand exactly how the switch all that stuff's kind of working, and then all of a sudden, all sorts of other ICAS messages just start lining up down the ICAS, and the autopilot kicks off, the yacht damper kicks off, and we request immediate descent to flight level 240. So we start descending, and during the descent, we declared an emergency at that point. And during the descent, temperature starts warming up, but my airspeed continued to decline, and it went all the way down below 40 knots and red X'd on me.
Wow.
It just completely red X'd.
It's more than just a blocked pitot tube then at that point, or frozen.
No, that is what it was.
Was it just frozen?
Blocked. Yeah.
Wow.
That's all it was. And so it wasn't a big deal. The captain's flying the plane. He's got control of it. And at some point, we exit IMC, and we decide to go to our alternate, which is Kansas City, which was just basically, we were going almost directly 090 prior to the hold. After the hold, now we're going 270, so we're going directly west. ATC just gives us a vector, fly heading 360. I mean, it's like easiest. Makes a 90-degree turn to the right. We exit IMC. We land in Kansas City, no problems. After we exit IMC, at some point, all my airspeed indication come back.
Oh, it did melt.
All the ICAS messages disappear, and everything starts working normally again.
Wow.
Which is what you would expect with a weak pitot tube heater.
Yeah.
I mean,
scary still. I mean,
that's all it was with Air France 447. Yeah, but look what they did. So
they didn't recognize, and Airbus logic. The Airbus is so automated that
it was, to me, it was the stupidest thing.
Pitch and power, man. Pitch and power. You back to basics.
That's something you're trained in the Navy. Even as a flight engineer, I was trained in pitch and power.
Yeah,
we had pitch and power charts out the yin yang. So, I mean, it's just the most basic private pilot training for a blocked pitot tube.
Yeah. I think that's like one of the first lessons when you're dealing with private pilot licenses. What happens if you get a bug in the pitot tube?
What are you going to see if your pitot tube's blocked? How do you recognize it? Because the first step is always, for any problem, is to recognize that you have one. And that applies well beyond anything in aviation. So the first step is, what kind of problem? Are you having a problem? Because if you're flying a plane, you should always be looking for problems.
That's it. Always looking for an out. What's it doing?
Yeah, flying the plane is the easy part. Looking for problems, that's the secondary part. That's a little bit tougher. Recognizing these problems is a little bit tougher. The more you fly, the more experience you get. That's where experience comes in, is to recognize issues. So you could recognize issues with better experience. You could get that kind of training. Training will help. Training actually makes up for a lack of experience if the training is good enough.
Yeah. By definition, knowledge is a change in behavior by result of experience. So old, bold pilots, not many of them around, but those that are.
Pilots and bold pilots, not many
old, bold pilots. So here you were, you did about 12 years at the Sandpiper, and you were able to take advantage of the wonderful flow-through agreement that Sandpiper has with the legacy carrier that we currently fly for at Legacy Airlines. And you came over in, was it March of 2018, was it? Yep. I was about a month behind you in April. And so that transition for me, and I've talked about it before, was amazing to sit there in that training environment and have them be like, oh, don't worry, you're all here, you're all going to pass. By the way, there's free coffee in the classroom, in the back of the classroom. You don't have to go down some hallway.
Yeah.
Talk about night and day. How was your experience? Was everything as positive as mine?
I have to say it was like that. It was very professional. I didn't run into any instructors or anybody that had a chip on their shoulder or was trying to prove something or anything like that. They were all highly professional instructors, all highly professional check airmen. And I had absolutely no problems getting into the 737 at all. In fact, I was surprised at how easy it was to operate and fly. Because I was expecting to be assholes and elbows all over the panels all the time. But that's just not the case. The 737 is far more modern than the 707 I came out of.
Yeah.
which
So,
required a flight engineer.
right.
Now, the 737 is the toughest plane in the fleet, is what they say, because it's old, and they don't want to change the panel on the overhead, and they don't want to change the console because it's going to require a new training, a new type rating or something like that. So they want to leave the 737 kind of like it was basically from 50 years ago, and but still, because of the automation that was added into the airplane, it's not technically difficult to deal with it unless you start having malfunctions. And then it's like any other airplane. The more you know your procedures, and the easier you could find them, then the easier it is to deal with.
Yeah. Easier to
And
recognize when
recognizing
something's
the
not
problem.
Right. Exactly.
Like the MCAS issue that they had last year.
Yeah.
That was a classic case of flight crew not recognizing what their prime problem was, which was a runaway stab trim.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically all it was, and they just didn't catch it.
Yep. So, your career in aviation is very impressive. I mean, between the flight engineer time and the experiences you had in the military, and then coming out, getting your instructor ratings and your education, and coming through the civilian world of commercial airlines and dealing with all the politics and relationship issues that come with 30, 40 years of dealing with all of this. It's just an amazing thing to kind of tug on your ear and say, hey, tell me about a time, tell me a story. And then you and I, we go beyond just knowing each other through flying and through commuting from the same airport, or when we were both living up in Washington State. We both upgraded around the same time. I know we both were in New York on our first captain upgrade at Sandpiper. And your crash.
My second.
Oh, your second. That's right, because you got upgraded, and then there was a displacement.
I upgraded in 2011 the first time.
That's right.
But of course, I upgraded. My Fed ride was November 3rd, 2011, and we filed for bankruptcy November 29th. Mm-hmm. So I was the last captain to upgrade in Sandpiper on the CRJ.
Yeah.
I think there was one guy ready to get his Fed ride the next day. They sent him back to the right seat.
Yeah. They kept moving my class, because I also upgraded, I think, about a month after you, and in that same vacancy bid. And then I was supposed to go to Miami Embraer, and they pushed my class date back a week, then 2 weeks, then 3 weeks. And then I never made it to they canceled it. Yeah.
You're going to stay where you're at.
Yeah.
Me, I stayed on the bottom of the list for 8 months straight, and then got displaced back to the right seat on the Embraer.
Right. It didn't last very long, because was it about a year and a half that you were?
I was in the right seat again for a year, exactly.
A year, yeah.
And then when I upgraded again, that was when you and I were in the same upgraded class along with John.
That's right. And there we were, commuting to New York from the West Coast. By then, I was living in Southern California, and you're still up in Washington State. And your crash pad was not far from mine, and we got to hang out a little bit, especially after getting released from work. And
Crew Gardens.
The Crew Gardens. Yep,
we talked about Brooklyn.
That.
It had its. I enjoyed a lot of that, but
a lot
of it I didn't like it.
The running I liked. The outdoor park that was right there, just next to the field.
We ran in that park.
In the park over there, yeah.
The pack.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was kind of interesting.
But then we both got a transfer after about 8 months of being in New York to the Chicago base. So there we were again, back in Chicago, and being at the bottom of the seniority list as the left seat drivers, we needed a place to stay. And I've spoken a little bit about crash pads in previous episodes. My first place was a nightmare, and you and I were talking about that, and you were looking to run your own crash pad. Can you tell us a little bit about how you stumbled across that idea?
Well, that was kind of just chance. When we came back, I contacted the same person who ran the crash pad I was in the last time when I upgraded the last time. So that was in 2011. So this crash pad, which I have come to call Terminal 9, was run by a CRJ first officer and his girlfriend, who's a flight attendant, both at Sandpiper. And I was in that crash pad for about 10 months I was all the way in the back bedroom in the top bunk there. And it was the nicest crash pad I had ever seen at the time. And the pictures of this crash pad had been on the crew wall at Sandpiper and down in the crew lounge for years at that time. And I had seen the pictures and they looked nice, but I never called the number because I got in my first 2.5 years I was in the pavilions in that crash pad.
Yeah.
And although I liked the pavilions, the building, our crash pad was a rat hole. It was disgusting. Nobody cleaned it. It was just all guys.
Yeah.
And if you took the shower curtain off, you could stand it up on its own. It was that bad. So it was a disgusting crash pad, but it was cheap.
Yeah.
The bunk beds were made out of 2x4s nailed together.
Oh,
yeah. So that was the way it was, man. It was just a bunch of cheap ass pilots all hanging out disgustingly. And there was 14 people in 2 bedrooms.
Oh, crap.
Yeah, there was 8 pilots in 1 bedroom and 6 in another bedroom.
Not good.
So 4 bunk beds in the back bedroom and 3 bunk beds in the front bedroom. And it was a tiny place. This place, obviously, Terminal 9, I have 11 beds. We have 1,800 square feet, 3 bedrooms and 2 full baths. And last week I was here for 5 days straight on short call and nobody else was here the whole time. I mean,
yeah,
I had 2 people here last night. And so I was a resident in 2011. And then, of course, when I got displaced back to the right seat after the bankruptcy, now I'm a senior first officer again, commuting back out of Seattle, holding a line, commutable lines. They were just commutable lines. That's all. So I could commute in day of and commute home last day. And it was easy. And then, of course, when I came back from New York with you, I went back to the same place. And I talked to the person and I said, hey, man, you got any openings? He says, no, but I'm selling it. And he asked me if I wanted to buy it. And after some consideration, I think I might have talked to you about it prior to actually accepting.
You did.
And you and I had that conversation, and then I decided to go with it. And of course, that's when you and I and John all came in here, and we stood this place up. Well, we didn't stand it up; we just took it over, basically.
Yeah.
And so there was there was a lot of existing residents in here from various airlines: Spirit Airlines, Frontier, SkyWest, all of them. It was well represented. It was co-ed. It had always been co-ed when I was here. Multiple positions are flight attendants and pilots. I had a ground pounder in here, ramper, when I came in. You remember one of them.
Yep.
And so it was, it's a diverse crash pad, which I actually liked. I don't like it when it's just all men, all pilots.
Yeah.
It's just
keeps everybody on their best behavior too, as well.
And it reminds me of the stories of people being on aircraft carriers. Screw that. So it's interesting. So that's how I took it over. And the person who was selling it, I guess he and his girlfriend, who were running this place for a number of years, had split up, and that's one of the reasons why they wanted to bail. So, and they didn't want to they just were burnt out on it. They didn't want to deal with it anymore. So that's when I stepped in. And prior to them, years before they had it, this crash pad was actually stood up in 2002 by a Sandpiper flight attendant.
Oh.
And she had the upstairs and the downstairs, and she ran both of them. And then at some point, she let the upstairs go, and they rented it out to someone else. And so this has been in the Sandpiper family and the Legacy family since 2002. So 18 years, this place has been a crash pad, and I've had it for the last 6 years now. I can't believe that the last people had that little 20-inch TV on there, and everybody was good with it. The CRT.
I know.
So that was the first thing I did was get a flat screen TV and bring it in here, and then get something to drive the signal so you could have a decent picture on it, and upgrade the internet. Bring in more routers, the printer, all that stuff. So there's all that stuff you have to maintain, and it's actually, for me, it's fun.
Yeah.
So I enjoy maintaining it. I enjoy having Chicago as a second home. It's an awesome place to live. You're very familiar with our community around here and
Oh.
how nice it is.
If I had to move to Chicago, that's where I would move, because you're still considered in the city, but it's all homes, duplexes, and it's all retired firefighters and police officers in that neighborhood, and parks and their kids running around. And it's not like the downtown hustle and bustle, but I mean, literally, we would watch the train go by from the front window and time it and go, okay, I got 15 minutes. I have 15 minutes to catch the next train, literally a stone's throw away. I mean, you couldn't ask for a better scenario.
I'm looking at traffic on Interstate 90 right now as I'm turning my head out the front window, and the train track is like right there. So, I mean, I love this place. I mean, it's a 3-minute walk to the train station. It's 10 minutes to the airport. It's a piece of cake.
Yeah, it doesn't get better than that. Yeah, I have very fond memories of Terminal 9, and just anyone that is interested, send me a message via the website at www.aviatortony.com, and I will forward your information when beds become available.
Yeah, you could just send them my contact information if they express interest.
That's exactly what I'll do. Yeah. So in your time there and now at Legacy Airlines, what has been your favorite layover destination?
Oh, Bermuda. Das Rock.
Ah, yeah.
I love Bermuda, man. I was there last July when I bid for Chicago, because most of the time I was based in LAX, as you know. But last year I was here for 3 months. I was junior. The first month was really no flying because it was international training, so I had to wait for that. And then I was on short call. But then I was also on short call, but I flew a lot. So went down to, I got a TDY to New York, involuntary TDY to New York for July of last year. And
so what's involuntary TDY, just for our listeners?
Involuntary temporary duty. Temporary duty is abbreviated TDY. And you could have a voluntary TDY or an involuntary TDY. And most people volunteer to TDY to a different base for a month so they could get some different flying, but it's based on the needs of the airline. So if they don't need you out there, they're not going to TDY you if you request it. However, if they need pilots at another base and nobody volunteers, they will take involuntary TDY starting at the bottom of the seniority list, and that's where I came in last year. So I got involuntarily TDY to New York. And at first I was pissed because the whole reason I came back from LAX to go to Chicago was to spend time at Terminal 9 at the crash pad at my second home, right? I was looking forward to it.
Right.
And I can't believe it. The second month I'm here, they TDY me to New York. And then when I saw the schedules in New York, my jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe it. First of all, in Chicago, I was number 2 off the bottom of the list. Not that the international division's that big. At the time, it was like 35 pilots or 40 pilots. But in New York, the division's even smaller. There was only 16 pilots on the 737 International Division in all of New York.
Whoa.
So all 3 bases, 16 first officers and about 16 captains, and that's it. But my seniority was number 9 there, so I had a lot more seniority.
Oh.
So what is that? That's 50% seniority. And I looked at the lines for Chicago for that, or for New York at that month, and there was exactly 9 lines, and I was number 9.
Huh.
I was going to hold the line. So since
go.
there's only 9 schedules to look at, it was easy to just look at and see what they were, right?
Didn't take very long to bid that at all.
I mean, normally you get hundreds and hundreds of schedules, and you got to filter them by, whatever it is you want to filter them, what time they start, what time they end, what stops they're going to, how many legs per day, whatever it is you want to filter them by. But when you only have 9 lines, you just look at them. I looked at all 9 lines, and there was one that was going to Bermuda every day of the month. It left from JFK at 18:30, one leg to Bermuda, lands at 10:30 there, spends the entire next day there at the Grotto Bay Resort, and then the next morning it comes back, leaving Bermuda at 8:30, arriving JFK 10:30.
Wow.
That's a commutable trip from Seattle.
Oh, even better.
starts at 18:30. You could commute in day of, so I could leave Seattle at like 6 or 7 or 8 and be in there with plenty of time to catch that flight, and probably get dinner beforehand. So if I wanted to, but since it was TDY, I had a hotel in JFK. I could have stayed downtown at the Club Quarters Hotel in Manhattan, but I didn't want to have issues.
Then you got to deal with the traffic.
Yeah, I'm not going to deal with that. So I just took the airport hotel at JFK. So I bid for this Bermuda overnight. Was leaving every day of the month. Every day they had one, so I just bid for all of them. And I figured I'll let them figure out which ones they want to give me, because I really didn't care. So they wound up giving me 3 Bermuda overnights. I had a week off in the middle of the month, and they gave me 2 Antigua overnights. And the Antigua overnights were one leg out of JFK at 8 a.m. to Antigua, arriving 11:30 Antigua time. But anyway, you get into Antigua, 26-hour overnight at the Veranda Resort, and then one leg back. So I had 3 Bermuda overnights and 2 Antigua overnights. And then what I did was I went in open time and see what was left. And there was another Antigua overnight. I picked that up and tagged it on to the last trip of the month.
TDY'd into paradise.
So I had 3 Bermuda overnights and 3 Antigua overnights, and they were freaking awesome. I loved it. And the interesting thing about Bermuda is that's where we used to stand the alert in the 80s on the C-130. I hadn't been to Bermuda since 1988. That was the last time I was in, 1993. But the last time I was there operationally standing the alert was 88. And then in 93, on the 707 on the E6, we had an emergency, and we had to do an emergency landing in Bermuda. That was an interesting story. Lost all 4 hydraulic systems, but we did emergency landing there. We wound up having to fix the plane for the next 3 days, and we hung out there for that duration. I was like 3 or 4 days we were in Bermuda, and that was 5 years after I had been there the last time. That was the last time I was there. So so when I got to Bermuda on the first overnight, the next day I rented a moped, drove all over what used to be the Naval Air Station, because that base was closed in 1995 from the BRAC Commission, which is the Base Realignment and Closure Committee. So they closed. That was in the 90s, mid 90s, when they were closing all the military bases that weren't used. Well, Bermuda was definitely a freaking.
They're on the chopping block.
Yeah. They should have closed that base years before that, but I loved it. So that was one of my favorites. Antigua was fun. The next month in August, I was back in Chicago, and I did St. Croix overnights, which again, I hadn't been there in over 30 years, because I went there once in the Navy in the C-130. We did an overnight, which was fantastic. And St. Croix, San Juan, what else? Punta Cana in the Dominican Republic.
Oh, I love
that one.
That was a good one.
Stay at that. That's cool.
Did you get to stay at the beach hotel, or was it by the airport?
No, it was the all-inclusive resort there, the one where you got to sign in and they check your ID.
Yeah, I did that one time on the Airbus. It was out of Miami, and we were supposed to stay at the hotel by the airport. And the whole crew gets on the shuttle service that they have, and we drive right past the hotel. And so now my number 1 flight attendant, who speaks fluent Spanish, it was like, what's going on? And the driver says, no, that hotel full. We took you to another hotel. And now we're like, well, wait a minute, where are you taking us? This is like the number 1 rule of when you get on hotel transportation. You go to where you're supposed to go. That's on paper, because especially in a foreign country. And he goes, no, we're going to take you to the, I forget the name of that hotel there. If it was a Westin, I think, Westin Resort, or something like that. And the captain's like, okay, quiet, nobody complain. That's a good hotel. Sure enough, we're on the beach, full all inclusive. It was a great layover.
Yeah.
To say the least.
Yeah, so Bermuda's my favorite. It wasn't all inclusive at the Grotto, but I don't care. I love going to the Swizzle and getting the conch fritters. But and the Swizzle, so you swizzle in, you swagger out. That hasn't changed in 30 years.
That's great.
At the time, and when I was standing the alert there, they didn't have rental cars in Bermuda, so all the tourists had to either get around they could rent mopeds, or they could take a cab. That's the only option you had. And there was a bus as well. You could, if you wanted to deal with the public transportation, you could do that. But when I got there, they had just introduced rental cars to Bermuda. and these are like glorified golf carts. So, so it's basically there's a single passenger rental car you could rent. It's basically a four-wheel moped that's enclosed, and then there's
Yeah,
two,
a little smart car.
yeah, and a two-passenger golf cart that's enclosed you could
Yeah.
rent. And they seem pretty cool. So it's nice if it's raining or something, you want to get wet, you can do it. Or you can rent a moped, take a chance. When I was there and I rented that moped, I hadn't rode a moped in over 40 years. So I had to practice with it a little bit before I take it on the road. So I'm like riding around the parking lot and all that, just figuring it out. It's a piece of crap.
Yeah.
And they all and all the locals there know you're on a rental moped when they see one, because they know what color helmet you wear, they know the license plate, they know what it looks like, and they actually know what profile you're actually driving on, which is usually slow. And I was no different. So I was there on the Sunday, and when I got a line of cars behind me, or any cars behind me, I would pull off on the next section and let them pass. You know, the roads in Bermuda are really narrow, and there's like like walls like on the edge of the road, so there's not a lot of room. And if they pass you, you know, on a turn and something's coming the other way, you better be ready to hit the brakes and let them go in front of you.
Yeah.
So I would just pull over whenever I could, and just let them pass, and there wasn't that much traffic. And I was pretty successful. The next two times I was there, I didn't rent a moped. I just wanted to go check out what was left at the Naval Air Station.
So to wrap it up here, a couple questions I wanted to ask
Okay.
you, a couple final questions. Let's say you can go back in time just for a moment and whisper into your younger self's ear. What would you tell yourself?
I would tell and I've gone through this scenario many times. I would tell myself at 20 years old, use a little more discipline in your life. Don't be so wild, because I was kind of nuts when I was a kid. I was a crazy kid, man. I was freaking nuts. I'm still a little bit on the fringe. I'm sure you know. But
I don't know what you're talking
I would
about.
tell myself to go through officer training and push myself through that and become a pilot in the military and get that training done and get that done. That's what I would have done back then if I'd have known better. But now it's different. So living vicariously through my own son, I'm trying to push him to get flight training. And we were on track to do that until all this stuff hit the fan. And you know about the issues that we had with that flight training. So he's still a young kid, man. And he still has his whole life in front of him. And so I'm going to do whatever I can to help him realize his dream, whatever that happens to be. And he wants to fly. He still wants to be a pilot. And so we're going to push that. So as soon as the flight training opens back up in that area, he'll continue his flight training, and I will support him as far as he wants to go with it. And hopefully he'll go all the way to the airlines, and then he'll make a lot.
Well, due to the cyclical nature of this industry, I mean, we're just happen to be in a very dramatic downturn, and it's all going to start to turn around here soon.
Yeah.
And how long that takes, nobody knows.
Yeah.
But it'll come back.
So that's what I would do. That's what I would say to myself when I was 20. Is, you know, stabilize your life, be a little bit more stable. Have a little bit more discipline and responsibility. My son has an advantage over me in that regard, in that he is he's far more disciplined than I was when I was his age. So he has more responsibility than I did growing up. He got in trouble once at school, but yeah, so what, man? I can't tell you how many times I had to deal with the authorities. It was one of the reasons I joined the Navy, was to straighten myself out, because living in South Florida at that time as a teenager was not working out so well. But I knew that, and I was able to do something about it. So at least I did that, and I got out of that environment. I changed it.
So speaking of your son, my next question is in relation to what you're saying right now. And that is, what advice would you give a young aviator in relation to today's marketplace? Kind of not with the COVID thing, but just in today's marketplace with everything that's going on. What would you tell a young person that says, I want to be a pilot?
I would tell them to pursue that, absolutely, because this is going to recover at some point here. There's no guarantee that something else isn't going to happen. But leave yourself an out. Leave yourself some kind of alternative, a viable alternative to being a pilot in case it doesn't work out for whatever reason. You never know what could happen. I mean, you could develop a medical condition that grounds you permanently.
Yeah.
So you should have the ability pursue the pilot path, but have an out, have some kind of parallel that you could do as well, a viable parallel, and pursue both of them. Focus on one, but keep the other one, available. Use it as kind of a hobby or something like that, so you can stay current on whatever it is you want to do. So, business degrees, you get a degree. I would always recommend getting a college degree to pursue this, because right now, while it's not a requirement to be a pilot anymore, to have a 4-year degree, it used to be, and they could easily reinstate that requirement. And I would be surprised if they actually did do that from this, because now that the demand for pilots has completely reversed itself again, I could see the requirements for hiring going right back up to where they were prior.
Yeah.
And that's probably what's going to happen to some degree. I mean, you're going to see that.
We've seen that already with the ATP, restricted ATP. If you have a 4-year degree in aviation sciences, then you can get a restricted ATP and get a job at a airline a little faster than you would if you had to just wait for the 1,500 hours.
Exactly.
So they're already kind of posturing in a position to implement this in the future.
Yeah, but the airlines are what drives a lot of the requirements. So because they don't need pilots right now, and they stopped all hiring, and now United and Delta are talking about furloughing, and a couple of our airlines have folded, like Trans-States, Compass. I think Mesa folded, right? Did Mesa fold?
I don't think they. I think they've dramatically reduced. I don't know any. I haven't heard anything yet of them folding.
GoJet is laying off. Although one of my pilots in the crash pad here works with GoJet, and he's not worried about getting furloughed. I have a SkyWest pilot. He's not worried about getting furloughed, as far as I know. Who else do I have? I think that's it now. I used to have a lot of different pilots, but
yeah. And we're going to start to see a lot of changes here come October, November, December timeframe, because if we can kind of get back to that magic number that I keep reading about of the 70% load factors, if we can get back to a 70% load factor, that's kind of the rounded out number where the airlines kind of break even for the cost of doing business. I'm confident and remain very optimistic with it that we might start to see those numbers early 2021, and which would be great, because then we can kind of, push back the idea of furloughing with the retirements. And we just announced more voluntary leave of absences, and and there's going to be a need for aviators when those floodgates open.
I think Legacy is in a good position to not furlough, and now the reputation of Legacy, as opposed to the other two, the reputation of the other two has definitely sunk. So now we're standing up as one of the best places to be right now, which is kind of a complete reversal of what it was just like 2 months ago, and had been established, for a while. So,
earlier today, I don't know if you were aware of it. I read just a little bit, and I need to dive into a little bit more in detail, but I understand that our sister company over there at the American airline has announced quite some changes as well. And let's see what happens if they adopt those things at Legacy as well. And that is their 30% reduction in management staff at their headquarters.
Oh, yeah. I read that.
That's a step in the right direction, at least for the optics of it all. You can't reduce everything, every aspect of your business, and then maintain your management staff. So hopefully it's not in the form of furloughs, but just a redirection of job titles and positions for temporary period
Yeah.
of time. I don't wish anyone to lose their positions, but a reduction in workforce at the upper levels says a lot about the staying power and the potential future direction. So that's a good thing. Final question for you. If you could think back to one person in your life that has made the greatest impact towards your success in aviation and in your career, who would that person be and why?
Oh, I'm going to have to hand that off to Stan the Man. Stan the Man. The people I flew with in the Navy know who I'm talking about. Stanley Grant was when I was working with Stanley, he was a senior chief petty officer airframer, and I was working for him back before I became a flight engineer. So this was in like 82, 83, and Stan was the senior chief in charge of the phase maintenance division for the C-130 in our squadron. And so I was working phase maintenance on the C-130. So I was I think I was grave shift supervisor for phase. And that was back along the times I was thinking about becoming a flight engineer because I was getting ready to, get promoted to E5, rank at E5, and that was the minimum rank. And Stan, Senior Chief Grant, basically had a lot of confidence in me. He says, you'll be a damn good flight engineer if you do it, and I think you should. I'm going to recommend. So he he endorsed it. And Stan had a very good reputation in the squadron as one of the best senior chiefs, or one of the best chiefs there at the time. And that endorsement of me and his confidence in me gave me a lot of confidence to move ahead and actually do that. So I put in for flight engineer for my re-enlistment that year because I was coming up to 4 years and at the rank at E5. So I put in for it, and he endorsed me, and I got it. So in August of 1983 is when I left for flight engineer training. I did my re-enlistment, headed out the door, and moved from the back of the airplane to the front of the airplane. And so I was up in the pointy end. So Stan the Man, Stan retired from VQ4 or wherever it was he did. And he came back to Tinker after we had moved to Tinker in 93. He was there in the 90s as a defense contractor. And I would see Stan walking across the hangar in his civilian clothes, and I would always talk to Stan. He was a really cool guy. And I really liked Stan a lot. So even after Stan retired, he was still a part of my life back like 10, 12 years later at Tinker at VQ4. And he passed away at the age of 50, pretty young.
I was young.
Yeah. I think that was after I retired. And that was after I retired. So I was living in Phoenix at the time. Real nice guy. And he kind of gave me a kick in my butt. It got me moving in the right direction to advance my flying career, which I did.
And thank you so much for sharing that. I've been saying for a long time now, as I get on in years, that I realize that we all, as aviators here in a professional environment, stand on the shoulders of those that came before us, and it is always a privilege and a pleasure to recall and honor those individuals. And thank you for sharing that story with us.
That's my pleasure.
Amazing.
Thank you for giving me the chance to do that. Yeah, just one last thing. My dad was also a big influence in my life. My mom was too, but my dad had a meticulousness to him that I just acquiesced to, I acclimated to. It became a part of who I am, and it worked well with the Navy because one of the things that they teach you in the Navy is attention to detail. Attention to detail. I mean, that's right from boot camp. And in boot camp, you never see that. That was the place it was actually pushed on you the most, was attention to detail. Because if you didn't pay attention to detail, the company commander would find it instantly, and you would hear about it in ways you didn't want to. So my dad was very meticulous. He ran a company in New Jersey when we lived there called Tip Top Services, and that was a janitorial company. So he was like a one-person workforce. He was the only employee. It was his company. He made it. And when I was a kid, I would go with him, at night to go clean office buildings, which was cleaning toilets and buffing floors. So I was buffing floors at the age of 10. So, and cleaning offices and stuff like that were closed. We didn't do it during normal business hours. We would be the only ones in whatever the places. There's Chrysler in New Jersey, Mack Truck in New Jersey, in Central Jersey, and all different kinds, Squibb, EJ Squibb, Edison Medical Group, all these places. We would clean these offices and businesses, and just general janitorial. We were the cleaning crew. So that's where I learned how to be meticulous, because my dad wasn't one of those people that would just clean around something. He would clean it. And so attention to detail was something that was instilled in me at a very, very early age. And I never forgot that. So I'll hand it to my dad for that one.
And thank you. And you and I have spoken about your very early work with your father, and like how when you clean something, do it right. Do it so that you're proud of it, and not just with the cleaning, but with everything that you do.
I mean, if you're going to do something, do it right. Otherwise, don't waste your time. I mean, I can't say that I'm 100% on, do that all the time, but that certainly is, it's a goal. It's a goal like anything else.
Right.
And if you can't do it, don't kill yourself over it. Just do the best you can. Know what it is you want to do. Try and get there. And if you can't get there because you tried hardest and it just wasn't good enough, then so what? You want to try it again? Try it again.
Are you okay with it?
Yeah.
That's it. Are you okay with it? If you're okay with it, that's all that matters.
Yeah.
But the attention to detail has molded who you are. I know you, and I can say this, that you're a very detail-oriented, mechanically, minded. So it's led you throughout your life and your progression in your career. So my hat's off to you and your father for instilling such high values.
Yeah. And Tony, it's just an honor to know you and fly with you and have you as a friend. So
thank you. And I share in your sentiment as well. Thank you so much for being on the show. For more on Squawk Ident, make sure you listen to anywhere you're listening to podcasts these days. And check out our website at www.aviatortony.com. That's Alpha Victor, the number 8, Romeo Tango Oscar November Yankee.com. Again, thank you for listening. And Bart, it has been an absolute pleasure.
Likewise, Tony. Thank you.
I'd like to take this opportunity and just say thank you to all the frontline workers out there. The doctors, nurses, pharmacists, EMTs, medical techs, firefighters, law enforcement, grocery store employees, truck drivers, Amazon workers, and of course, all the airline employees out there that show up to work every day to provide the essential services that we do. If you're enjoying Squawk Ident, I encourage you to share the show with your friends that you might think are also interested in hearing about the aviation journey and all the stories that come with it. Facebook and Instagram users can search Squawk Ident Podcast, and Twitter users and YouTube users can search Aviator Tony and Squawk Ident. If you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify, it would really help us out greatly if you could just take a moment and leave us a review. One final thank you to my guest for episode 43, Mr. Bart Meltzer, for taking the time to share his journey with us. And thank you for taking the time to listen to this grateful aviator. Keep the dirty side down, be safe, and take care of each other.